My name is Alex Wisniewski. I'm the Parks Director for Kitsap County. And I just want to express my gratitude that you all took time out of your busy schedules this evening to be with us and your interest in this project and the future of Port Gamble Forest Heritage Park. Tonight marks our third public meeting and one in which we will begin to see all of the work from the previous public meetings come to life and actually see some alternative renditions of what the future of the park may look like. To me, this is the most exciting phase of the master plan process. And so I am just very happy to be here and that you are here with us tonight as well. Good stuff. So thanks for joining us tonight. Your voice, your thoughts, your ideas are important and it's going to help guide this process forward. With that,
the next slide.
We can move on to the next slide. And a quick introduction of our team. This is our master plan team before you here. The team is comprised of Fisher-Boma Partnership for planning, Anchor QEA for environmental, and Highlands Economics for economic analysis. You will hear from most of them tonight in the presentation or as moderators later when we do our breakout rooms. OAC is managing the project for the county. And we also have a community-led steering committee. And thanks to Mark, Don, and Catherine for being this team for us and their invaluable contributions. Next slide. So quick introduction. We were tasked with creating an inspiring master plan for this huge, rather large 3,500 acre county park. We are in the midst of a 12-month planning effort. That's how long this planning process will take, and attempting to balance the recreation and conservation opportunities that the park affords us. Next, please. Before you use our calendar of events, we're about 2/3 of the way through the process and have completed the first 3 phases. Presenting the plan alternatives is our goal tonight. The master plan is expected to be completed by the end of the year with review and approval occurring in early 2022. So tonight's agenda includes we'll start off with a brief recap of public meeting number 2, and then launch into some presentations looking at the suitability analysis of the land, trail planning efforts, spatial planning and what that looks like in the park, and then diving into funding and economic development. And then at the end, following these presentations, we will have an opportunity to break out into different sessions and actually have some interaction amongst us and take comments about the presentations tonight and be able to get your valuable feedback.
Thanks, Alex. Good evening. My name is Jeff Bauma. I'm going to quickly highlight some of the content from the second public meeting back in June. If you're interested in hearing that presentation, you can find a recording of it on the project website. Next slide. We presented challenges and opportunities at the park based on 4 emerging themes: recreation, natural resource management, environmental and cultural education, and funding and economic development. Next slide. For each of those 4 themes, we presented opportunities in the form of either facilities or the programs that could be supported by those facilities. We then polled meeting participants to gather feedback on their preferred facilities and programs. These results, in combination with stakeholder outreach and collaboration with the project steering committee, inform the development of the alternatives that you'll see tonight. Next slide. I'm going to quickly flip through a number of slides here that we presented at the last meeting as a reminder of those opportunities. The 3 most preferred in each group, per the polling we did, are indicated with a bright green thumbs up. We presented potential recreation facilities. Next. We presented potential trail opportunities, and you can see multi-use loop system trails and hiking trails were the most popular. Next. We presented potential recreation programs, some of which would require facilities to support them. Next slide. We presented potential natural resource management programs to transition the working forest to a healthy landscape and forest. Next slide. We presented potential education facilities, focusing on both environmental and cultural education. And finally, next slide. We presented potential educational programs, again, some of which would require facilities to support them. We'll now hear from John at Anchor about the suitability analysis that was performed for the project, which guided both the recreation development and the restoration proposals.
Thanks, Jeff. Next slide. So as Jeff mentioned, there's two parts to this analysis. I'll start by walking through the analysis we did for all these different types of recreational development. Because there's such a broad range of types, we were pretty non-specific in terms of siting. We just looked at large areas that would be suitable for different types of site development. And then our second analysis is really on the condition of the forest across the park. And that is intended to help inform the management decisions in the future and help guide how those management resources are used. The next slide. So initially we looked across the entire park, looking for sites that were more suitable for development. We excluded sites with steeper slopes or that were near mapped streams and wetlands to stay away from those areas. We also noted that the western track and the shoreline track were purchased with deed restrictions. And a lot of the types of development that Jeff just mentioned may not be compatible with those. But not to say that all the types of development would be incompatible with those deed restrictions. And then we, can you stay on the first or the previous slide for a second? Go back one. Thanks. Then we started to focus in on the areas that were closest to existing vehicle access and also closest to utilities. So as you see these darker colors in blue, those are the areas that are fairly proximally located to existing parking, existing access, water lines, and potentially power lines as well. So that kind of focuses us into this northern area and down by Stottlemyre Road. Now we can go to the next slide. So up near the ride park, we identified several areas, larger contiguous areas greater than 5 acres that might be suitable for the different types of development that Jeff mentioned. Again, we didn't assign specific suitability for specific uses at this point, but we did notice or did know which areas were already cleared and which areas were forested, with the intent that some types of development are much more compatible with cleared areas. And so we would want to make use of that as we're going into the programming of actual sites. And we'll get into that here shortly. It also pointed us to the area at the south along near the Stottlemyre entrance. And all of those sites were forested, but also quite large in many cases. So gave us a range of options to consider in terms of the alternatives that have been developed. All right. That's kind of it on the recreational development piece. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the condition of the existing forest and some of the recommendations for management and how that could occur going forward. The first two maps I'm showing on the left are wildfire fuel loads. The darkest color green has the highest fuel load. Lighter green also has a significant fuel load. And then these areas that appear almost white are recently cleared, tend to have a lower fuel load. When we talk about fuel load, we're talking about primarily two different things, tall and possibly dead or dry shrub layers, but with enough volume to create hotter flames. And we're also referring to trees that have grown in an even age stand after harvest, could be 20 to 40 years old, and they've developed a whole lot of lower branches that have died off. They've been shaded out, and those branches are still in place. Both of those things constitute what's referred to in fire management as ladder fuels, and they can help a fire get from the ground up into the crown and be much more devastating to a forest, and burn hotter and burn longer. To the right, we've identified some priorities for forest thinning, and thinning is an important management strategy for us to consider, in part because it will help reduce some of the fuel loads, but also because it helps to create diversity in the species of trees and the size of trees in the forest. And that diversity helps increase the resilience of the forest to not just fire, but a host of other types of disturbance, disease, drought, wind throw. So it's an important consideration on both levels. And these on the right, these higher, darker green are the most or the highest priority for thinning. And you see in a couple of cases, the blue lines and the gold lines indicate where that's also an area with high fuel loads. Next slide. Great. We also looked at a current level of invasive vegetation and identified areas where invasive vegetation control is a priority. In some cases, these darker green areas on the left indicate where invasive vegetation is most problematic. And in some cases, these are recently harvested areas where Scotch broom has come in aggressively. It's also areas adjacent to those where invasive species have started to come into the understory of forested areas. On the right, we identified areas where the addition of greater diversity of native species, particularly in the understory, but also tree species, is important. And those include those recently harvested areas, but they also include areas where we have a closed canopy of even-aged Douglas firs again, and that's really eliminated any kind of understory development except for a very few species. And now would be the time to get in there and plant additional species and start to build that more diverse and more resilient forest ecosystem. So we pulled all that together into this last slide, and I'll mention that all these maps are available online. Jackie, can you go one more? Great. All these maps are available online, and you can see them hopefully a little better. They're hard to read, I realize, in this format. So this map identifies what we're calling the conservation priority. It's the stands that are on a trajectory to remain healthy on their own are shown in dark green and in this peach color. The peach color also represents areas that have steep slopes, wetlands, and other features that would make them more vulnerable to disturbance from future logging or other efforts. But it all, this is not this is intentionally not a complete discussion or a complete analysis of what the future management is. This is just what are the conditions currently that should be considered in looking at opportunities for using the limited resources that we have in managing this forest. So we identified the peach areas as areas that would benefit from more or less being left alone and not disturbed. The dark green areas are doing well on their own, but could use some input. And then some of these other areas probably are in more need of more urgent management efforts in the near future. Great. Back to Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, John. As most of you know, the dominant recreation activity in the park is trail use by hikers, bikers, equestrians, and others. This activity will likely be the most dominant activity in the future as well. In this next section of the meeting, I'll present two things. First, trail standards, and second, the proposal for improvements to the current trail system. To develop new trail standards and trail plans, we reviewed the existing trail types in the park, existing trail uses, current access to the trail system, regional trail connections, official events in the park that use the trail system, the history of installation and maintenance of trails within the park, and current signage associated with these trails. Much of this review included conversations with trail users from varying trail user groups. Next slide. The county's 2018 PROS plan, and PROS stands for Parks, Recreation, and Open Space. That plan expressed the need to develop more detailed trail standards, formalize those, and implement them into standards or those standards within county parks. The Kitsap non-motorized facilities plan also addresses trail standards based on different classes of trails. The table from that plan can be shown on this slide, and I realize it's not readable, but that's available online. The county currently is just loosely using the same classification system developed by the Forest Service, but this is yet to be translated into a county-wide program that drives design, implementation, and maintenance. Trail development and maintenance has historically been performed by park stewardship groups and volunteer efforts. In the master plan, we'll be recommending that the county formally adopt the Forest Service trail classification system and associated standards, not only for this park, but for all county parks. The Forest Service utilizes a series of documents of increasing detail, each which supports the previous. These include trail fundamentals, design parameters, and standard specifications for construction and maintenance of trails. Next slide. The trails in the park will typically be Class 5, Class 4, and Class 3 per the Forest Service system. Class 5 trails are considered fully developed and will typically be about 10 to 12 feet in width with a paved surface, and will be shared use paths that are regional connectors such as the STO trail. Class 4 trails are considered highly developed and will typically be 6 to 10 feet wide with a gravel surface. Many of these are existing logging roads, which will continue to be used for forest management activities in addition to recreation. These, like most trails in the park, will be multi-use. And then Class 3 trails are considered developed. Those will typically be 3 to 5 feet wide with soft surfaces such as dirt, dirt or combination of dirt and gravel. Those will also be multi-use. Next slide. So now that we've discussed trail standards and classes, let's talk a little bit about the proposed changes. The Class 5 STO path will primarily be built on top of existing logging roads, minimizing disturbance. Most of the existing logging roads will be maintained and designated as Class 4 trails. Some will be transitioned from Class 4 down to Class 3, which is less developed and used only as recreation trails. Most of the existing dirt trails will be maintained and designated as Class 3. Just a few will be transitioned up to Class 4 or wider gravel trails for maintenance vehicle access where needed. Some of these trails will also be decommissioned. Next slide. So the following several slides that you'll see will attempt to show diagrammatically the transition from the existing trail system to the proposed trail system. In the map to the left, all the current roads and trails are shown on the plan. The skinniest black lines are the existing narrow dirt trails in the park. The medium black lines are the existing wider gravel logging roads. The approved STO trail is actually shown on this map for reference, even though it doesn't exist since it's been approved. It's the thickest black line running down the center of the park. These two maps are essentially the same, but the one with colors on it show existing trail types. The approved STO is shown in yellow. This map also shows the logging roads in red, and the dirt trails is either green, blue, or black, indicating the difficulty level of that trail, a system developed by the Park Stewardship Committee over the years. Not currently shown on these maps is the water trail located in Gamble Bay to the east. Something I also want to point out on these maps is how many dead-end spurs there are. Those are the red lines, which is good for logging, but not necessarily for recreation. Next slide. So the maps on this page show the proposed changes to the trail system and the proposed trail classifications for that new system. The colorful line segments on the map indicate potential changes. Dashed red lines typically indicate a logging road that will not continue to be maintained as a road or a trail, but could be used in the future for forest management activities. As such, it will not be fully decommissioned. Solid red lines indicate trails or roads that would be fully decommissioned and restored to forest habitat. Decommissioning was determined by criteria such as the trail being redundant, maintenance difficulties such as always being wet and muddy, its impact on a critical area, for example, such as a wetland or stream, user experience being limited, or the route being a spur trail that dead ends. It's also important to note that the timing of decommissioning and transitioning of various trails will be dependent on the timber harvest schedule and will require additional coordination with Rayonier or the timber company. Other changes include transitioning some of the wide gravel roads down to narrower trails. This is indicated in yellow. There are a few segments that would be transitioned from a less developed trail to a wider, more developed trail as shown in orange. New trail classes are identified on the map to the right. You can see the Class 5 trail, which will be the paved STO, shown as the wide white line running north and south. Class 4 trails, the dark solid lines, will continue to be used for forest management access and will be wide gravel multi-use trails. And the Class 3 trails, the dashed lines shown throughout the park, will be the narrow dirt multi-use trails we've talked about, or single-use trails. Trails to be designated as hiker only or Class 2 more primitive trails have yet to be determined. Next slide. So this table tallies the old and new trail distances and shows that there'll be about a net change of 1.8 less miles of trail in the park based on these plans when considering development of new trails and decommissioning of existing. These numbers, it should be noted, currently only account for trail mileage within the park boundaries, not trails still currently on the adjacent timber company land. There's quite a bit more trails on timber company land. The negative numbers shown in bright yellow are the 10 miles of trail or road that would be decommissioned. The orange numbers, about 11 miles of trail, are proposed for modification from one class to another. And the brown numbers, about 8.5 miles, are the new trails being proposed. Next slide. These maps start to look at the trail system programmatically. The trail system is a network that will tie together the recreation and education facilities that are being proposed, which you'll see in more detail shortly. The trails can connect places for learning and personal enjoyment. Several destinations have been identified that could take the form of viewpoints, simple rest areas with benches, or outdoor classrooms, for example. These preliminary locations have been identified during discussions with users and stakeholders and from personal experience during field reconnaissance. Access to the trail system is also important, as is parking, since most visitors continue to drive to the park. The map on the right shows existing access points and parking areas as black symbols. It shows potential access points and parking areas as white symbols. Larger parking areas, in this case defined as about 25 or so vehicles, are indicated by a solid dot. Some of these parking areas will be discussed in more detail when presenting the spatial alternatives. Next slide. So we'll now transition from the proposed trail plan to 3 development alternatives that the county, The steering committee and the consultant team have been considering, each based on input from community and outreach to multiple stakeholder groups. Next slide. So before we dive into the three spatial alternatives, there's similarities amongst them based on the vision and goals developed by the community for this park. First, proposed uses and facilities will generally be nature-based. Facilities will be designed and located so that they're multiple use, flexible, and adaptable. Development of facilities is generally clustered at the north end of the park, and I'll go over the reasons for that a little bit later. The remainder of facilities are small and dispersed throughout the park and support the trail system and are nature-based, such as viewpoints. Facilities are planned and will be designed to allow for phasing and for growth. And development of facilities will occur in conjunction with a program to improve landscape health, predominantly the forest throughout the park. Next slide, please. This diagram represents the area within the 3,500 acre park that's being proposed for development versus conservation for each of the alternatives. We've spoken a lot about development of recreation and educational facilities during this master planning process. However, from the graphic, you can see that the development footprint is relatively light. A few things to note. The gray green is generally the forested area that will be conserved, restored, or enhanced as part of the natural resource management programs. This area also includes most of the trail system previously discussed. The pale yellow wedge in the pie is the 177 acre mountain bike ride park that's already approved. This is essentially a series of trails beneath the existing forest canopy. The sliver of orange is the area taken up by the STO trail as it winds about 6 miles through the park, much of it on existing logging roads. And finally, the recreation and education facilities that are being proposed are represented by the blue sliver, which ranges from about 10 acres to 50 acres in size, depending on the alternative. Next slide. So bear with me for a moment on this slide. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail here before we look at the plans. Now, this table identifies the uses and facilities proposed for each of the alternatives labeled A, B, and C in the 3 columns to the right. The level of development increases from alternative A to alternative C. For example, looking at one of the line items, parking, the cumulative number of parking spaces proposed in several different parking lots within the park increases from 260 in alternative A to 495 in alternative C. I'm not going to go into detail on each of these line items, since you'll see many of these proposed facilities talked about in upcoming diagrams and plans. A couple things worth noting though. One, if you look at light green box number 4, we've proposed a new event staging area. The large grassy flat area known as the airfield, which is currently used to host many events in the park, is actually located to the north of the park on Rainier property. This area, we've been told, will not likely be available in the future for recreation use per plans that Rainier has for the site. So we've proposed a staging area of 2 acres, 4 acres, and 8 acres in each of the 3 alternatives respectively, and you'll see where that is in a moment. Another example, green box number 3, wildlife viewing areas, you can see increases from 2 to 4 to 8 with each respective alternative. Looking at yellow box number 9, the adventure tree course. That's not included in alternative A, but it is in B and C. Light green box number 11, camping. It's not included in alternative A. However, subsequently larger tent camping, 40 tents and 80 tents, is proposed in the latter 2 alternatives. This camping would support park events as well as provide potential accommodations for summer students. And then finally, moving down to educational uses and facilities, which is orange box number 19, an environmental and cultural education center, including a restroom, is proposed in all 3 alternatives, increasing in size and complexity in each alternative. In alternative A, it would be a small facility with an outdoor classroom area. In alternative B, it would be a bit larger and combined with a small research facility. And in alternative C, it would be larger still and independent of a research facility. In all cases, the structure would provide for multiple uses and be designed with the flexibility to expand depending on the growing demand partnerships with colleges and universities, or the need expressed by the community. Next slide. So the following plans, you're going to see 3 of them here. They're meant to be diagrammatic and to show the concentration of proposed uses and facilities within the park. The dots on these plans do not represent the exact size of the proposed facility. There's 3 sizes of dots shown for parking, small, medium, and large, and only 2 sizes of the dots for other facilities, just small and large. The size of the dot only generally relates to the intensity of the facility. For example, a small viewpoint along a trail is shown as a small dot, while a several-acre campground is shown as a large dot. Just to reiterate, the dots are meant to show the distribution of proposed uses throughout the park. In alternative A, as shown on this plan, the uses are clustered at the north end of the park. Highlights of alternative A include a small education center with outdoor classroom. That's the pink and orange dot next to each other. That would focus on the environment and culture. A gathering place is also included within that pink and orange dot. A gathering place is considered to be the focal point in the park for people to meet and gather. The space will serve multiple functions and may be a combination of indoor and outdoor covered space that will likely be associated, with that outdoor learning center. This concept is still being developed in more detail, and will go into more detail in the preferred alternative. The alternative also includes additional parking, the gray dots, a relocated staging area for events, which you can see is at the light green dot, a nature playground, the blue dot, and a picnic area, the tan dot. Restrooms, trail rest areas, and wildlife viewing areas are shown as small dots dispersed throughout the park. Next slide. So this diagrammatic plan also shows the concentration of uses at the north end of the park. And in addition to the uses already mentioned in alternative A, the following have been added: a larger event staging area, the light green dot, and a larger environmental learning center, the orange dot. Additional parking, a tree adventure course located within the canopy of the ride park, which is the bright yellow dot, a larger nature-based playground, the light blue dot, and a small campground, which is the green dot right in the middle. It also includes more restrooms, wildlife viewing areas, and small outdoor classroom opportunities throughout the park. After looking at the next alternative, we'll look at all 3 side by side for comparison. We'll also be looking at enlarged plans of the north end of the park for each alternative in just a moment. Next slide. Again, a majority of proposed uses at the north end of the park, but there are significantly more than in the previous alternatives. In addition to the uses already mentioned in alternatives A and B, the following have been included: an ecological research station, the purple dot, which would be independent of an education center, a native plant nursery, shown as the yellow-green dot below the purple one. Once again, additional parking, a larger campground, a 9-hole disc golf course, which is the green dot, an amphitheater, the pink dot at the top, and once again, more restrooms and wildlife viewing areas. Next slide, please. So these 3 diagrammatic plans, which you just saw, shown side by side, demonstrate the increased level of development for both recreation and educational facilities in each alternative, both dispersed throughout the park, but mainly at the north end. We're not going to simply choose one of these 3 alternatives. It's likely that the preferred alternative will be a variation of one of these based on the feedback we get from the community and decisions made by the county. Next slide. So why have we concentrated uses and facilities at the north end of the park? 1, the area is close to Port Gamble town and existing utilities. It will be serviced by a new road through Rainier property from the north. The area is adjacent to the approved STO and ride park. It's relatively flat, large area. There are less critical areas in this location, such as streams, wetlands, and steep slopes. There are existing and potential views from the top of the ridge. If you've been up there, you've probably enjoyed some of those. Many of the timber parcels in this area have recently been logged, so there are no trees. There would be reduced development and maintenance costs by clustering. And finally, the north areas within the east block, the deed for which has less development restrictions compared to the west and shoreline blocks of land that make up the park. Next slide. So we'll now zoom into the north end of the park, that area that appeared as a cluster of dots on the previous diagrammatic plans. These enlarged plans show that the facilities are more dispersed within this northern area based on the scale of this map. For reference, the red box on the map of the park to the right is the enlarged area shown on the left. On the enlarged plan, Highway 104 is the thickest black line, and then the small orange dot with arrows coming out of it near the bottom of the plan is the existing viewing platform that you might be familiar with and have hiked to in the park. Clusters of bubbles in the middle of the plan include parking, which is gray, the event staging area in light green, the gathering place and small environmental center in orange, and outdoor classroom in pink. This group of facilities will be serviced by a new road shown as the medium black line coming from the north property boundary. You can also see the little bit thinner black line, that's the proposed STO trail, and the ride park indicated in yellow on the left-hand side of the plan. Small parking lot and nature-based playground shown in blue are also located near the north property line. Next slide, please. So in this enlargement plan, you can see the addition of the adventure tree park within the ride park to the left. These would coexist within the same footprint or large yellow area. The event staging area, the light green bubble, has increased in size, as has the gathering place and the environmental learning center, the orange bubble. Small campground, shown in bright green, has also been added. This would be run by a concessionaire for the county, similar to other potential revenue generating uses, such as the Tree Adventure Park. Picnic area has also been added near the north property line, which is the tan bubble. Next slide. In this enlargement plan, you can see the addition of a disc golf course as the large dark green bubble, and the addition of another campground loop in bright green. The research facility has also been added, the purple bubble, as has a native plant nursery below it, the yellow-green bubble. Other facilities have expanded in size, such as parking and the event staging area, the light green bubble. A second picnic area has also been added to the central nexus of facilities shown here, which is the tan bubble. Next slide. So once again, all three enlargements of the north end are shown here side by side for comparison. It's important to note that the bubbles are general areas at this point. There's room within each of the bubbles for facilities to move and adjust. And as we begin more detailed design of the preferred alternative, the actual facilities won't necessarily be in such close proximity to each other as they might appear in these concept bubble plans. Next slide. So for each of the proposed alternatives, we've been developing high-level cost estimates. These estimates include the recreation and education facilities we've been talking about, as well as all of the trail improvements. They also include the forest management activities that will be necessary to transition to a healthy forest. The costs include annual operations and maintenance, or O&M, shown in the yellow segment of each bar. It's important to note that even if nothing discussed here tonight would be implemented, there would still be baseline O&M costs at the park associated with existing trails, parking lots, and forested landscape. Indirect costs, the orange portion of each bar, includes planning, design, engineering, and permitting for the proposed capital improvements. And finally, capital costs, the blue portion of each bar, includes the actual cost to build or implement these improvements. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Barbara, our economist, to discuss potential funding of the ideas that have been presented.
Thanks, Jeff. My name is Barbara Wise, and I'm happy to be with you tonight to talk about funding and economic development. Jackie, next slide, please. So Jeff just presented costs for the park, and we wanted to just give you a sense of park's costs that have already been developed. So looking at state parks, because they're similarly typically larger sized parks compared to municipal or smaller city parks, across the Western states, the average cost per acre managed in those state park budgets ranges from $600 to $1,000 per acre. So that gives you a sense, these are already developed parks. And if we were to apply those per acre costs, and if those were equivalent at Fort Campbell Heritage Park, that would be $2 to $3 million annually. So not to say that that would be the costs, but just gives you a sense of the magnitude. And in general, across state parks, user fees, so things paid for things like camping or parking, they only cover about 25 to 30% of the state park budgets. So it's really, there's a few parks in the state park system in different states that cover their operating costs fully through user fees, but they're pretty rare parks. So the conclusion there is pretty high costs and likely that facilities would only cover a portion of the revenues needed just to maintain and support the park, and not even counting capital costs. Next slide, please, Jackie. So what are our options for funding? So one option is public funding through the creation of special districts or taxing mechanisms in the county. Another option is donations and grants and partnerships with nonprofits for operating. Another option is general park user fees. And when I say general, more like parking fees that everyone or nearly everyone using the park would pay. And then finally, more facility user fees. So the different facilities that Jeff was mentioning, whether it be payment for something like camping or rental of a facility, or concessionaire arrangements where a concessionaire would come in and do food concessions or something like that, and a percent of the revenue would go to the county. So one note with funding, John talked a lot about restoration and forest thinning and different practices for restoration. And in general, based on the county's experience, those are pretty revenue neutral, meaning their costs basically are the same as the revenues that bring in. So that's not an option that we see as funding for the park. Next slide, please, Jackie. So at the last public meeting, we talked about these options a little bit, and we had some feedback from people that attended the last public meeting about which options might be more preferred. And we had people compare, say, facility use fees to community taxes and see what people preferred. And this just gives you a sense. Those on the left, so non-recreation type uses like energy development or farming leases were the least preferred options. And for community members that attended last time, the most preferred was community taxes. And in the middle fell facility use fees and general use fees. And then we didn't ask in the last public meeting about trade-offs between land uses and grants and donations and partnerships, since grants and donations will be pursued in all master plan alternatives. And there's not really a land use trade-off with those. In terms of willingness to pay for the park, respondents, and nearly all respondents at the last public meeting indicated they'd be willing to pay at least $25 a year or more to recreate at the park. Next slide, please, Jackie. So in thinking about the responses that community taxes were one of the most preferred funding mechanisms, we looked at some examples of what local park taxing districts are, what revenue they bring in, and what the taxes are for a home. So the Bainbridge Island Metropolitan Parks and Recreation District is one example. And the revenues that they bring in annually are about 5.6 million. And that the assessment rate translates into, for a $500,000 home, about $27 monthly. Another example is the Village Green Metropolitan Park District in Kingston. And that one is much smaller. It's to support one facility. And that brings in $300,000 annually in revenues. And the tax on a home that's valued at $500,000 would be about $6 monthly or $76 annually. Next slide, Jackie. So another option is user fees. And we were looking at what are some of the facilities that Jeff mentioned that have revenue potential, at least to cover operating costs. And so this gives you an idea of sort of the ranking of which facilities have the highest revenue potential. And those are some of the higher development options, like an adventure course, tree adventure course, or more developed accommodations like yurts or cabins. Also event venues. So things that could be used for cultural, environmental, or local community workshops, but also might be able to hold corporate retreats or weddings and have rental fees associated with those. Also, covered pavilions and campgrounds and trail event spaces have some revenue potential. Next slide, please, Jackie. So another piece that we're looking at is what's the economic development potential? So not just the ability for facilities to support park operating costs, but also what is the benefit to the Kitsap County economy? And one element of that is to what degree might this park play in attracting tourism and visitors to the county? And so in thinking about that, there's certain types of facilities that tend to attract out-of-town visitors. And those tend to be things like trail events and races, things that are more unique, like adventure courses. Yurts and cabins are always popular in natural areas, and the state has relatively few compared to population for those. Events, whether it be at an amphitheater, like a music concert, or an event like a wedding at an event venue. And then also the two already permitted and planned facilities, the bike park and the Seattle, the Sound to Olympics Trail, which is also part of the national Great American Rail Trail. So it connects to other regional trails and it connects to through a national trail. So that also has a big potential to bring in visitors. And in terms of magnitude, the economic benefits, based on other existing studies of the value of tourism in Kitsap County, if you had 1,000 groups or parties coming to overnight in Kitsap because of the park, for every 1,000 parties, you'd have about 8,500 in local tax revenues and about 75,000 in local earnings that would be generated. That just kind of gives you a sense of the benefits there. The other type of economic development that comes from parks is arguably much larger. The Kitsap County economy has developed largely because of its quality of life, and outdoor recreation is a big part of that. So as you can see at the diagram on the left, that figure, tourism can contribute to local jobs and income, but there's a much bigger arrow about how parks and recreation attract and retain residents and businesses. So that the role that parks play in increasing quality of life and the importance that they are to people, it has a much bigger role in contributing to economic development typically, because if you think back to the last slide, if we have 1,000 people coming, 1,000 parties coming to the county and contributing 75,000 in income, that's like attracting one resident to the county that would have 75,000 in income with a good paying job. So particularly as people are able to work remotely, and then the last year and a half, how that has become even more prevalent, the ability of places like Kitsap County to attract people from all over that want to live there because of the high quality of life, that's a really big economic development piece. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we are going to transition to our breakout groups. And so all participants are going to be split randomly into 3 groups. And each group is going to spend 20 minutes with a facilitator leading a discussion on 3 different topics. We're going to have forest restoration, trails, and spatial plans and funding. And then after 20 minutes, the moderator, you'll switch to another moderator and topic. And then after we get through all of the breakout sessions, we'll come back together for final closing remarks and wrap up.
Back over.
Yes.
We really appreciate your time this evening. Jackie, if you could go to the last and final slide of the night. Just a few comments on next steps. We'll take all of your feedback that we heard today. We'll consolidate it and synthesize it and study it as a consultant team, a steering committee, and the county. And over the next month or so, we'll start to develop the preferred alternative based on what we heard. Please also know that in the next week or 2, there'll be an updated website with all of this information on it. And there'll be a new questionnaire. So you'll be able to peruse the information you saw tonight and provide your feedback in that questionnaire. The remainder of this year, we'll be working on the preferred alternative, and we'll have the next public meeting in either late 21 or early 22, depending on the holiday schedule. So once again, thank you very much. I don't know if Alex or Commissioner Gelder want to say any last parting comments, but we really appreciate your time.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate, just saying thank you for taking the time this evening, and hope to see you out there on the trail someday. And turn it over to Commissioner Gelder for final words.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Jeff, and the whole entire team. It's pretty interesting when you think about if we were to actually have had an in-person open house and how we might have done that and how many people would we actually have had. When I was looking at sort of the peak participation tonight, it was actually very impressive. And thank you all so much for carving out a couple of hours of your evening and kind of during Zoom and being switched around in rooms. It was actually kind of nice that our moderators moved around instead of the majority of us, because it probably caused less whiplash that we could potentially experience. But thank you all so much for being engaged and helping us to kind of create that ultimate vision that can go into the preferred alternative. So yeah, it's definitely a team sport. Thanks so much.
Welcome. My name